That M is a liability, not an asset. There goes Bud and his museum piece. Carl Neese said it loud enough to carry across the elevator parking lot. He had two farmers standing with him, and he gestured toward Bud's flatbed trailer, the way you'd point out something unfortunate. A rusted gate post, a cracked concrete apron, a thing that ought to have been dealt with by now. The two farmers laughed. A short sound. More agreement than amusement. Bud Larkin was 40 feet away, unhooking the chain binders on the trailer. He didn't turn around. Carl called out, "I'll give you $850 trade, Bud. Get you into something this century." Bud said without looking up, "She's not for trade." The chains came loose. He folded them into the bed box, closed it, and walked around to check the hitch. He had heard Carl say it before. He would hear Carl say it again. That was fine. Carl could think whatever Carl thought. The M sat on the trailer in the September light, red paint worn at the hood corners, the metal showing through in places the size of a man's palm. The exhaust stack straight and clean. It was a 1952 Farmall M, manufactured in the year Bud's father turned 23. Rebuilt by Bud over 3 winters before anyone knew what it would run into. But what Carl Neese did not know, what he could not have measured from a parking lot or a spec sheet, was that in 3 weeks, a rain event would come to Pulaski County, and every computerized tractor on 3 neighboring farms would go silent in the mud. And the one machine running would be this one. No hydraulics, no electronics, no module that needed a reboot, just a rebuilt magneto, a mechanical brake system, and a man who had not stopped since 6:31 in the morning. Do you know this kind of machine? Not a tractor exactly. A decision. A commitment to something old and sound that nobody around you believes in until the day the new things fail. But before we get to that Wednesday in September, let's go back to the winter of 2009. And the first time Bud stood in his father's shed with the M sitting cold and the question in front of him. Harlan Larkin had parked the M in the shed in 1987. He was 58 and his back was giving him trouble, and he had bought, that summer, a used 1977 Oliver that could pull heavier loads with less of the constant manual attention the M required. He had not intended to give up the M. He had intended to get back to it. He didn't. He died in 1993, and the M went to Bud in the estate, along with the 320 acres and the farmhouse and the notes on the drainage work Harlan had started in 1982 and finished in 1985, which Bud had read and reread many times, because they told him more about how to farm this ground than any extension publication. For 16 years, the M sat in the shed. Bud farmed around it. He had a 79 John Deere 4440 for the heavy work, a 91 International for field roads and grain cart, and the M in the back of the shed, taking up space and representing a question he was not yet ready to answer. The question was, can it be made right? In 2009, Bud turned 55. He had been farming the same 320 acres for 31 years without 1 year off. And he was at the point a man reaches when the practical and the personal align, when you're experienced enough to know what the job will cost, and old enough to know why it matters anyway. He went into the shed one afternoon in late October and looked at the M. It had been sitting for 22 years. He walked around it, He pulled the crank. He checked the carb. He found what he expected to find: seized fuel line, deteriorated gaskets, magneto corroded on the exterior. What he did not find, what he had to verify carefully, was catastrophic damage. No cracked block, no bent rods. The engine had been put away dry, without water in the cooling system, and the December freeze that had cracked two of his neighbor's old block engines had not touched this one. Harlan had known how to put a machine to bed. That was the answer to the question. Bud went into the house and called his brother in Jefferson City and said, "Dad's M is repairable." His brother said, "Why would you bother?" Bud said, "Because it'll run another 50 years. His brother said, "Bud, just buy something newer." Bud said, "Talk to you at Christmas." He hung up and started a list. The rebuild took 3 winters. You do not rush an old magneto. And Bud was not a man who rushed. The first winter, 2009-2010, he stripped the magneto to components on the workbench in the shed, the cold coming through the sheet metal walls, his breath visible in the work light. The magneto was a Fairbanks Morse unit, a design that had been on the M since production. Simple and reliable, and absolutely not something Carl Neese's parts department was going to help him with. Bud had found a source through an antique tractor dealer in Iowa, a man named Arlen Vance, who specialized in pre-60 IH and kept a stock of magneto components that the mainstream dealers had written off 20 years earlier. Bud had called Arlen in October and described the condition. Arlen had shipped a rebuild kit, a set of condenser points, and a new coil, and had included, without being asked, a 2-page handwritten specification note describing the gap and timing settings for a 1952 M. That note was pinned to the shelf above the workbench. It was still there. Bud worked the magneto in the evenings after chores, an hour or 2 at a time, the way you do anything that requires patience rather than speed. He cleaned the housing, replaced the points, set the gaps to Arlen's spec, reassembled it by the same order he had disassembled it, and mounted it in February. He cranked the M in the shed on a Thursday afternoon in February, with the snow still on the ground outside, and the engine turned over twice and caught. He stood there for a moment, listening. It ran rough for 30 seconds, clearing the carb circuit. And then it smoothed out. The particular sound of an M engine, different from modern diesel, deeper and more deliberate. The sound of an era when engines ran at lower RPM and produced their torque differently. He shut it off. He went inside. He did not tell anyone. The second winter, he replaced the carburetor needle valve with a new one from the same Iowa dealer. He rebuilt the steering gear, the worm and sector type worn from 40 years of hard use. The play in the wheel enough to make field work imprecise. He had the sector shaft machined at a shop in Rolla, 60 miles away, by a machinist named Tom Garrett, who had done vintage equipment work before, and who said, when Bud brought in the shaft, that it was the cleanest 60-year-old piece he'd seen in years. "Whoever put this machine up took care of it," Tom said. "My dad," Bud said. Tom said, "He knew what he was doing." Bud said, "Yes." The third winter, Bud addressed the hydraulic lift cylinder, the one used for the 3-point implements, and replaced the seals. He replaced the fuel tank sending unit. He repainted the hood and fenders with the factory red. Not a perfect restoration job. Not the kind of thing you'd show at a county fair, but solid and clean. He left the wear at the hood corners where it was. Those marks were the machine's history. He wasn't going to paint over them. He put the M in the rotation in the spring of 2012. Grain cart work, field road runs, the jobs where you want a machine that starts and runs and does not surprise you. He had been running it every harvest since. 10 years, not one failure. Carl Neese had been watching, from the elevator, from the co-op lot, from the implement store window, for 10 of those years. The opinion had not changed. Carl was 55 and had been running the county implement dealership since his father handed it to him in 1998. He had built the business on the modern cycle. That cycle had logic. New iron cost more up front, but the trade-in interval, the parts revenue, the service contract, the telematic subscription. It was a system that worked for the dealer and worked for the farmer who wanted someone else to manage the complexity. Carl was good at what he did. He understood his customers. He understood the spreadsheet of a modern farming operation better than most. What he did not understand, what he had no category for, was the man who did not need the cycle. You've met someone like that. The person who has gotten outside the system entirely, not by rejecting it angrily, but by building something the system never thought to offer. Carl could not figure out what to do with Bud, and so he defaulted to the only tool he had, the joke about the museum piece, offered at intervals in public, in front of people who would laugh. In August, Carl sold a new, GPS-equipped cab tractor to a young farmer named Danny Pfeiffer, $74,000, 0% financing for the first year, telematics package included. He walked Danny around the lot and noticing Bud's M visible on the county road heading toward the field, used it as a prop. GPS-guided auto-steer telematics, Carl said, tapping the spec sheet. Nobody harvests serious ground on a Farmall M anymore. That's Truman administration equipment right there. Danny looked at the M. Carl said, $850. That's what I'd give for it, in trade. Danny laughed. Two lot workers listened. The spec sheet was impressive. Bud's M was not impressive. In the way spec sheets measure impressiveness. You cannot spec sheet a rebuilt Magneto. You cannot put a bricks number on mechanical brakes. But mechanical brakes work in the rain. That was the thing Carl did not know. If you've ever watched a computer fail in conditions the manual didn't anticipate, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Leave me a comment. I want to hear what you've seen hold up when everything new quit. We'll get back to the story in a moment, but subscribe first so you don't miss the rest of this one. The September rain event arrived on a Tuesday evening and was still falling Wednesday morning at 5:30 a.m. 2 inches overnight, with more coming. The kind of rain that comes during harvest week in Pulaski County and does exactly what it always does. Turns the field entries to 2-inch deep mud, fills the drainage tiles to capacity, makes tractor operation in the low corners a matter of careful weight management and slow speed. This was not unusual. This was September in central Missouri. What was unusual was the brakes. The hydraulic brake system on the two late model tractors that Danny Pfeiffer's neighbor, Gene Holt, was running. One of them, the exact model Carl had sold Danny 2 months earlier, had developed a water intrusion issue in the hydraulic brake module. Gene's lead machine had given a brake pressure warning light at 5:52 a.m. He had stopped the machine and called Carl's service line at 5:58. Carl's tech arrived at Jean's field at 7:20 with a diagnostic tablet. The tablet identified the module issue and confirmed what the tech already suspected. A field fix was not possible. The module required a firmware update that required the dealer's programming rig. Both tractors would be down for the day at minimum. Gene Holt stood in the rain, looking at two tractors sitting in his field entry. He had 400 acres of corn to finish. At 6:14 a.m., while Carl's tech was still on the road, Nora Shields had called Bud. Nora was 61, had farmed the ground south of Bud's place for 30 years, and had bought a late model tractor through Carl's dealership 2 seasons ago. She had been running it without trouble. Until this morning. She stood at her kitchen window with the rain coming down and said, "Bud, my tractor's down. Hydraulic brakes, nothing. I've got 400 acres to move." The window framed her field entry, standing water at the low corner, the corn still in the rows, waiting. Bud said, "I'll be there." He hung up. He pulled on his boots and his canvas coat and walked to the shed. The M sat in its position, center bay, same spot he'd pulled it into after the last harvest run. The wear at the hood corners caught the shed light. Bud climbed up, set the choke, and reached for the crank. The engine caught on the first pull. No warm-up needed. Not really. The M wanted less warm-up than you'd think for a September morning. The engine having been run regularly enough to maintain its operating tolerance throughout the season. Bud let it idle for 2 minutes, listening to the even cycle of the engine. Then he backed it out of the shed and hooked to the grain cart. He arrived at Nora's field at 6:31. She was standing at the field entry in the rain, the failed tractor behind her, watching him come down the road. He backed the cart into the staging position and looked at the field. He said, "Where do you want to start?" Nora said, "East end first." He said, "Let's go." He made the first pass at 6:38. The M does not move fast. That is not its virtue. Its virtue is that it moves continuously, without complaint, in conditions that newer machines evaluate and judge and occasionally refuse. The mechanical brake system, drum brakes, cable actuated, the same design that had been on the M since 1952, did not interact with water the way the hydraulic systems did. There was no module to intrude upon. There was no firmware to require. There was a cable and a drum, and when Bud pressed the brake pedal, the machine stopped. In mud or sun in September, rain in any weather Pulaski County had ever produced. He made the second pass, third, fourth. At 9:15, Carl's tech called Carl from Gene Holt's field. He said both tractors are down for the day, possibly 2 days. The module update needs the shop rig. Carl said, "Buck, stay on site. I'll come out with the service truck." He pulled out of the dealership at 9:40 with his tech and the service rig. He was on the county road heading toward the Holt operation when his rear right tire picked up a 16-penny nail from a grain wagon track and deflated. He pulled onto the shoulder. He called his tech. His tech was at the third farm. A neighbor 2 miles east who had called at 8:30 with the same hydraulic brake complaint, same model, same module. 3 farms, 3 tractors, same failure mode. Carl stood on the shoulder in the rain and looked down the road at a Farmall M in a field about 200 yards ahead, making its 6th pass. He called for a spare. He waited. The M kept running. Bud finished Nora's field by 11. He called Gene Holt from the cab, parked at the field road, the engine idling. He told Gene where he was and what he had. Gene said he had 400 acres too. Bud said he'd be there at noon. He drove to Gene's field, hooked the car to Gene's auger wagon, and started the first pass at 12:10 p.m. He did not stop for lunch. He had a thermos in the cab. He ate a sandwich his wife had packed the night before, stored in the cab box. He ate it while making the third pass on Gene's field. The M steady under him, the rain lighter now but still coming. At 3 p.m., a woman with a notebook found him. Her name was Liz Farrar. She was a staff writer for a national implement trade magazine in Pulaski County for an unrelated story on row crop drainage systems, and the co-op manager had mentioned the situation at noon. 3 tractors down, an old farmall running through all of it. Liz had driven to the field. She watched the M come down the row. She asked Bud, when he stopped at the field edge, what year the tractor was. He said, 1952. She said, "How long have you been running today?" He said, "Since 6:31 this morning." She wrote in her notebook. She asked if she could photograph the machine. Bud said, "It's a free country." She photographed the M on its 9th pass, the worn hood corners, the headlights on, the M's profile against the gray September sky. Bud's hands on the wheel. The field behind him, Roseclee. She wrote the caption later, at her desk in Kansas City, 52-year-old machine, 3rd operation, 9th hour. The photo ran the following month. The 3rd farm was Dale Wimmer's place, 2 miles east. Bud arrived there at 4:45. Dale was waiting at the filed entry, the failed tractor behind him in the mud. The same expression Gene and Nora had worn that morning. The expression of a man who has been waiting and is relieved but does not say so. Dale said, "Bud." Bud said, "Dale." He backed the cart into position and started the first pass. Carl Neese was still on the shoulder of the county road when the spare arrived at 4:55. He changed the tire with his tech's help, took 40 minutes, was back in the truck by 5:40. By then, Bud had completed 3 passes on Dale's field and was on his 4th. The M's headlights were on. The light was going. Carl drove to Dale's field entry and parked on the road. He sat in the service truck and watched the M. It was on its 12th pass. The engine note was the same as it had been at first light, not strained, not laboring, just running. The worn red paint caught the last of the evening light. Bud was in the cab, both hands on the wheel, not looking toward the road. Carl's phone rang. It was his tech, confirming that the module order for the Holt and Pfeiffer machines was placed. Estimated arrival 2 days. Carl said, "Okay." He watched the M finish the pass and turn. He watched it start another. He put the truck in gear and drove back to the dealership. He did not say anything to Bud that evening. He did not say anything to Bud that fall. Bud had thought about the winter of 2009 often since then. Not with sentiment. He was not a sentimental man, but with the particular attention you pay to a decision that turned out to be right. He had gone into the shed that October afternoon with no guarantee of anything. The M might have had a cracked block under the surface scale. The cylinder walls might have been scored beyond use. The head gasket might have failed and been undetectable until the first run, when it would have blown and cost him more in machining than the tractor would ever justify. He had made the decision anyway. not from stubbornness. Carl thought it was stubbornness. Carl thought most things he didn't understand were stubbornness. Bud had made the decision because his father had put that machine up correctly, and a machine put up correctly by someone who knew what they were doing was worth investigating before you wrote it off. That was all. That was the whole of it. His father had been 58 when he parked the M. The same age Bud was when he started the rebuild, which was a coincidence he had noticed and kept to himself. Harlan Larkin had farmed these 320 acres from 1961 until he died, and he had run the M for the entire back half of that period. Grain cart, field roads, the rough work that chewed through equipment if you weren't careful. He had been careful. He had done the oil changes on schedule, and the filter replacements, and the belts, and the hoses, and the kind of continuous, small maintenance that keeps a machine in its prime rather than its decline. He had also taught Bud to do it. Not in a formal way. There was no class, no instruction hour. He had done it, and Bud had watched and eventually helped, and eventually done it himself, while Harlan watched. And by the time Bud was 16, he could do anything on the M his father could do. And at 22, he could do a few things better. That was how the knowledge passed. Not through a manual. Through the shed, in the evenings, in the hours after supper, when Harlan would go out and Bud would follow. When Bud found the observation ledger in the desk after the funeral, his father's notes on the drainage work, 30 years of water table records and tile outlet measurements, and the specific fields that had to be managed with cover crops rather than worked bare in the fall. He had understood that he was looking at the farm's memory. The things Harlan had known that existed nowhere else. Written down not for anyone in particular, but because the land was worth the attention, and the attention was worth recording. He had treated the M the same way. The rebuild log was in a spiral notebook on the shed shelf next to Arlen Vance's spec notes. Bud had kept it from the first day of the first winter. What he had done, in what order, with what parts from what source, and what the machine had done in response. He had kept it not because anyone would read it, but because the work deserved a record. If the M outlasted him, and he suspected it might, the next person would have what they needed. That was the kind of thinking Carl Nees could not price. Carl came out to Bud's operation once, in 2016, for what he called a fleet review, a service he offered customers to evaluate their equipment needs. He had not been invited. He had called and said he was coming, and Bud had said fine, because Bud was a civil man, and Carl was a neighbor, and some conversations are worth having, even when you know where they end. Carl walked around the shed with a clipboard. He looked at the 4440, which he said was past its prime, but still tradable. He looked at the International, which he said was marginal, but usable for light work. He looked at the M. He said, "This one I won't even put on the sheet." Bud said, "Why not?" Carl said, "No market for it. 850 is charitable." Bud said, "She ran 220 hours last harvest." Carl said, "Bud, the parts don't exist. The service labor doesn't pencil. You have a liability here, not an asset. When it breaks down, you're going to be down for however long it takes you to find whatever antique dealer has the component you need." He wrote something on the clipboard. He said, "I've got a deal on a 2014 demo unit right now. 60,000, telematics package, 3-year service contract. You put this whole shed on the lot, and you're at the same capital position. Plus, You've got support. Bud said, Are support? Carl said, B, when something goes wrong, you call me. Bud said, When something goes wrong now, I fix it. Carl said, That's not scalable, Bud. Bud said, It's worked for 7 years. Carl wrote more on the clipboard. He left at 2:30 with a handshake and the name of a parts auction in St. Louis he thought Bud might like. And Bud thanked him and watched the truck leave the drive and went back to the shed. He picked up the rebuild log. He wrote, October 12th, 2016. Carl Neese Fleet Review. No change. He put it back on the shelf and went to work. The conversations happened in other places too. At the elevator, where Bud brought grain in September, and Carl was often present, talking to farmers about the fall buying season, the demo days, the new equipment lines. Carl would see Bud's trailer and make his comment. The museum piece line, or the liability line, or sometimes just the look that said everything without saying anything. And the farmers in earshot would smile or laugh or nod. And Bud would do what he needed to do and leave. He had never disputed a word of it. That was not weakness. It was calculation. A man who argues with Carl Neese at the elevator in front of other farmers is a man making Carl's argument for him. Bud had nothing to prove at the elevator. He had things to do. He did them. What Carl did not understand, and what the farmers around him were beginning to sense in the years after the M came back into service, without anyone quite saying it, was that Bud was not running the M because he was stubborn and could not afford better. He was running the M because it was the right machine for the work. That was a distinction that looked like stubbornness from the outside and looked like engineering from the inside. And you had to be inside to see the difference. The M's virtue was specific. It was not faster than the new machines. It was not more comfortable. It did not have GPS guidance or auto steer or the telematics that could alert Carl's service desk to a hydraulic pressure drop before the operator noticed it. What it had was mechanical simplicity. The kind of simplicity that has no failure mode in wet weather because there is no electronic component to fail. Drum brakes, cable actuated, magneto ignition, carburetor with a needle valve that you could adjust with a screwdriver if the altitude changed or the fuel mix ran lean. Nothing that needed a firmware update. Nothing that queried a server before it would run. In normal September weather, that simplicity was an affectation. The thing Carl called Truman administration equipment, and not entirely wrong. In the September weather that arrived that year, it was the only thing in 3 farm sheds that worked. The rain had been forecasted for Tuesday. Most of the county's farmers had been pushing to finish their open fields before it arrived, running late into Monday evening, the combines working by light. By Tuesday midnight, 2 inches had fallen and it was still coming. By Wednesday morning at 5:30, the county's low fields were standing water. The field entries, the gravel and dirt approaches that tractors used to enter the rows, had gone to deep mud, the topsoil over clay pan going soft and sloppy, in that particular way that central Missouri clay does when it has taken all the water it will hold and is returning the rest to the surface. Bud had been up since 5. He had his own work to finish. He was at the shed when Nora called. He listened to what she said. He said, "What's the diagnosis?" She said, "Hydraulic brakes, nothing." The light came on and then the pedal went soft. He said, "How long ago?" She said, 20 minutes. I was already at the field. He said, Who knows? She said, I just called Carl's line. They said a tech will come. He said, when? She said, they said within 2 hours. He said, I'll be there in 15 minutes. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Bud, you don't have to. He said, I'll be there. He hung up and went to the shed. What Bud understood, that Nora did not yet, and that Carl's tech did not either, was that a hydraulic brake failure on a computer-managed system is not a field-fixable problem. It is a module problem. The module is a sealed unit that the dealership programs. The dealer's programming rig is at the dealership, not in the service truck. The service truck carries diagnostic tools that tell you what is wrong. The rig at the dealership is the one that fixes it. 2 hours, minimum, for the tech to arrive, confirm the diagnosis, call the dealership, and establish that he cannot fix it in the field. Then the machine sits until the module arrives, or until they can tow it to the shop. 400 acres of corn, 2-day rain window, minimum. He started the M. He was at Nora's field at 6:31. He ran 4 passes while the tech from Carl's dealership was still driving to Gene Holt's field, 2 miles north. The M moved through the mud at 4 miles per hour, pulling the grain cart on the headland turn with the careful precision of a machine that does not have hydraulic power steering, but that responds to the operator directly. The full weight of the steering transfer going through the wheel in Bud's hands, his forearms absorbing the field's irregularities, making the micro corrections that kept the cart on the row without GPS assistance. That was the other thing about the M. You drove it, not managed it, not monitored it. Drove it with your hands and your weight and the full body knowledge of the field that 40 years of farming the same kind of ground produces. It was not easier than the new machines. It was not more comfortable. But it was something that Carl's telematics subscription could not replicate. A direct connection between the operator and the machine and the ground, no intermediary, no interpretation layer. Bud did not think about this while he was driving. He thought about the rows, the yield monitor's reading, the sound the cart made when it was approaching capacity. He thought about the drainage in Nora's east corner, which he knew from 30 years of neighboring. There was a tile outlet at the east fence that backed up in heavy rain, and he needed to stay left of it on the final pass, or the cartwheels would sink through the gravel cap. He stayed left. By the time Carl's tech confirmed that Gene Holt's first tractor was down and called in the module request, Bud was finishing Nora's field and calling Gene. He stayed on Gene's field from noon to 4:15. He ate the sandwich from the cab box at 12:45, not stopping, making the pass, the rain lighter now, but the mud still deep. He finished the thermos by 2 o'clock and refilled it. He had a second thermos in the cab box, the kind of preparation that takes 30 seconds and becomes, on a 12-hour day, the difference between a man who functions and a man who doesn't. At 3:04, he saw the service truck on the road. It was on the shoulder, flat rear tire, Carl standing next to it in the rain with his phone out. Bud made the next pass without looking toward the road. He finished Gene's field at 4:15. He drove to Dale Wimmer's. Carl was still on the shoulder when Bud passed. Neither of them acknowledged the other. Bud arrived at Dale's field at 4:30. Dale was at the entry, arms crossed, not because he was cold. He had his canvas coat on, but because that's the posture a man takes when he's been waiting and does not want to say how long. He said Bud's name. Bud said his. He backed the cart in. He started the first pass at 4:38. The sun was dropping. At 5:15, the headlights came on automatically. Bud had a switch for them on the dash, rewired during the second winter of the rebuild, a practical addition to a 1952 design that had not anticipated harvest runs after dark. The lights caught the standing corn and the harvest dust and the particular color of a Pulaski County September evening, which is a color that does not have a name, but that every farmer in the county knows because they have seen it at the end of a long day more times than they can count. He made the 12th pass as the last light went. He saw Carl's truck on the road. Carl had gotten the spare changed. He was parked at the field entry, not getting out, watching. Bud finished the pass. He turned the cart. He made the 13th. He finished Dale's field at 6:47. He backed the cart out and drove the M home in the dark, the headlights throwing the county road in front of him, the fields on either side in the particular flat dark of a cleared September night. He had been on the machine for 12 hours and 16 minutes. He parked the M in the shed. He checked the oil. He went inside. His wife had soup on the stove. She did not ask how it had gone because she had been hearing updates all day. Nora had called her at noon. Dale had called at 4, and she had pieced together the shape of the day without needing the narrative version. She put the soup on the table. Bud sat down. He said, "The M held up." She said, "I heard." He said, "Done 3 farms." She said, "Oh, I know." He ate the soup. He went to bed at 8:30. At the October co-op meeting, Nora Shields stood up during the open floor period and said she had something to say. The room went quiet, not the anticipatory quiet of a controversy, but the attentive quiet of a room that knew Nora did not get up to talk unless something needed saying. She said, "I want to thank Bud Larkin. His 1952 Farmall M pooled my harvest this September, and Gene Holtz and Dale Wimmers, 3 farms, 12 hours. He didn't charge any of us $1. She sat down. Carl Neese was in the back of the room. The room was quiet for a moment. Then someone started to clap. It was Dale Wimmer. Then Gene Holt across the aisle. Then the room. In a low wave, not a performance, just the sound of people confirming a fact they already knew. Carl looked at the grain price sheet in front of him. The magazine photo was pinned to the co-op bulletin board by December. Liz Ferrar's caption, 52-year-old machine, 3rd operation, 9th hour, someone had added, in marker at the bottom, and still going. Carl read it the first time he came in for the December meeting. He did not remove it from the board. The following spring, a young farmer from the county knocked on Bud's shed door. Not Danny Pfeiffer. A different one. A kid named Kyle Renner, 26, who had been farming his grandfather's 80 acres since college, and who had heard about September from his father and had been thinking about it since. He said, "I heard about your Farmall." Bud said, "Come in." He showed Kyle the magneto, the Fairbanks Morse unit, Arlen Vance's rebuild kit, Arlen's handwritten spec note still pinned to the shelf. He showed him the rebuild log he'd kept in a spiral notebook, 1 entry per winter. What he'd replaced, where he'd sourced the parts, what had surprised him, what had not. He showed him the parts cabinet on the second shelf, the spare needles, the spare condenser points, the small inventory of IHM components that Carl's dealership could not find, and that Bud had been building since 2009. Kyle looked at the parts cabinet. He said, "Carl told me these don't run anymore." Bud climbed into the cab. He reached down and set the choke. He hit the starter. The engine caught on the first crank. He let it idle for a moment, the deep, even cycle of the M engine filling the shed. Kyle stood next to the machine, his hand on the fender, feeling the vibration of it. The wear at the hood corners was 2 feet from his face. Bud said, "Tell him you saw it." Kyle nodded. He did not buy a new tractor that year. He bought a 1954 Farmall Super M from a retired farmer in Lynn County and drove 200 miles to get it. He called Bud from the road on the way back, the machine on a trailer behind his truck. He said, "Where do I start?" Bud said, "What's the magneto look like?" Kyle said, "Not great." Bud said, "Come by the shed. I've got Arlen's number." Here is what this story is about. And it is not about tractors. It is about the difference between what a system measures and what a thing is actually worth. Carl Neiss's system measured a 1952 Farmall M at $850. Trade-in value, parts availability score, telematics compatibility, modern dealership relevance. By every metric the system used, the machine had no value. Carl was not wrong about his system. He was wrong about the machine. The machine's value was not in its spec sheet. It was in the rebuilt magneto and the mechanical brakes and the 22 years of continuous operation and the man who had taken 3 winters to make it right. It was in the knowledge that you cannot buy in a dealership and cannot measure with a diagnostic tablet. It was in the fact that when the modules failed in the rain, one machine in the county started on the first crank and ran for 12 hours without a question. You know this feeling. Maybe not with a tractor. Maybe with a skill, a method, a way of doing something that the people around you have decided is obsolete. And maybe you've stood in a parking lot and heard the joke and not turned around. Because you knew what the thing was worth even when nobody else did. And maybe you have had the September morning when the thing that nobody believed in was the only thing running. That morning comes. You have to be ready for it. You have to have done the work in the winters before. Tell me in the comments, what is the thing in your life that everyone said was finished and you knew wasn't? The machine, the method, the skill, the piece of land, I want to hear it. Share this story with someone who is keeping something running that everyone else has written off. Hit the like button if Bud's M deserved better than $850. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. It comes from Texas, a rancher, a 3-page easement from 1903, and an attorney who found out that some documents last longer than the people who wrote them.